our increasingly global perspective, focusing in particular on the New South. So we are constantly looking for new ways of understanding government, perspectives on innovative methodologies, and Professor Wang's book has a whole range of methodologies which from a South African point of view or from an Africanist perspective are quite extraordinary. The kind of data which he's able to analyze, and it would be interesting to see what is possible in the South African and African context. We are focused. We're not an academic outfit per se, although we're drawing constantly on academic conversations to better understand government, understand its dynamics. But our privileged focus is on drawing on this kind of analysis to better understand how we can engage in our local context in South Africa, in other places around the world, so that we can make a contribution to improving the way government works, especially in the context of ordinary people's lives. Professor Wang, let me introduce you. You have a short introduction, but it's extraordinary career. Professor Wang is Professor of Government at Harvard University. He's the author of Tying the Autocrat's Hands, Cambridge University Press 2015, and the book which we're discussing tonight or today, The Rise and Fall of Imperial China, Princeton University Press from 2022. Professor Wang received his BA from Peking University and his PhD from Michigan. So why this book, I think, is especially interesting in our context, and we're going to hear more about it now, is that Professor Wang offers a conceptual framework, which I think is quite compelling in our local circumstances. In particular, his focus on elite contestation, what he calls an elite social terrain, a very innovative concept, I think, both for our understanding in South Africa, but also more generally for understanding state formation, I think is very important. It resonates very strongly with the work that I've been doing on elite contestation in South Africa. And I think Professor Wang provides a conceptual framework to help us understand these dynamics, both here and comparatively. So his book helps us think about challenges of government generally, but also specifically around in South Africa and in Africa. Professor Wang concludes with a discussion which includes a discussion of African states, and it's something which we can return to into the discussion. As I mentioned, there are two key concepts which I think are incredibly, potentially very, very useful for scholars of government in South Africa and in Africa, and also for those of us in the public policy space. The idea of a sovereign's dilemma, and I'll ask Professor Wang to talk a little bit more about that, and also this idea of an elite social terrain. Two concepts which I find very, very compelling intellectually, but also potentially very, very useful practically as well. On that note, I'm going to hand over to Professor Wang, who's going to speak to us and take us through the book for the next half an hour, and then we'll have a discussion and open it up to the broad audience. So, Professor Wang, again, it's a great privilege to have you. Great pleasure that you were able to join us. I hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chipkin. It's such a pleasure to give this presentation. I've never been to South Africa, so when I received the invitation, I was honored, and then I know that there's a massive power outage in South Africa right now, so I hope you are all doing well. Let me start by sharing my screen and presenting the main ideas of my new book. The book is titled The Rise and Fall of Imperial China, The Social Origins of State Development. The book was just published last month with Princeton University Press. I want to start with two observations about Chinese history in the last 2,000 years based on the data I collected. The first one is the fate of Chinese emperors in the last 2,000 years, from the first emperor, the Qin Shi Huangdi of the Qin dynasty, to the last emperor of the Qing dynasty in the early 20th century. And then what I did here is I collected the biographic information of all the emperors. There were about 400 emperors in the last 2,000 years. I collected the biographic information of all of the emperors. And then specifically, I collected the information on how those rulers died. And then I discovered that only half of the Chinese emperors died naturally. That is, they died of disease, and then they left their office and passed their throne to their son. But then among the other half, actually a large number of them were deposed or assassinated by the elites. And then here, what you are seeing in this graph is the probability of being deposed by the elites among all the Chinese emperors over time. And then the way I calculate this is I choose 100 years, for example, from year 0 to year 99. And then the denominator is the total number of emperors in that 100-year period. And then the enumerator is the number of emperors in that period who were deposed by the elites. And then so I calculate the probability and then move 1 year, I calculate the probability again. So what you see here is a line. And then you can see in the first half of Imperial China, in the first 1,000 years, the Chinese emperors became increasingly insecure. That is, their probability of being deposed dramatically increased up until to the Tang Dynasty. This is the 9th century dynasty. Almost half of the Chinese emperors were deposed by the elites. But this probability peaked in the 10th century and then started to dramatically decrease starting in the 11th century in the Song Dynasty. And then in the Qing Dynasty, for example, which is the last dynasty of China, almost none of the emperors were deposed by the elites. So this is about the Chinese emperors. But also, I was also interested in seeing what happened to the Chinese government. So here, what you are seeing is the physical capacity of the Chinese government in the last 2,000 years. And then in the upper graph here, what I did is I collected all the major fiscal policies in the last 2,000 years in every dynasty. And then I gave each policy a coding. For example, if the policy was designed to increase taxation, I would give it a coding of +1. If the policy was designed to maintain the status quo, I would give it a 0. If the policy was designed to decrease taxation, I would give it a -1 coding. And here you are seeing the moving average of that coding over time. And you can see in the first half of Imperial China, in the first 1,000 years, most of the policies on average were designed to increase taxation. But then that changed in the second half of Imperial China. Starting in the 11th century, for example, most of the policies on average were designed to maintain the status quo or decrease taxation. This is very similar when we look at per capita taxation. This is the total amount of taxation divided by the total population. You can still see there's an upward trend in the first half of Imperial China, and it peaked in the 11th century and then started to decline. There's one spike in the 14th century, but on average, in general, the trend has been going down in the second half of Imperial China. To the late Imperial China period, for example, the Ming and Qing dynasties, the Chinese government was not able to collect a lot of taxes from the society. So what we are seeing here, in the first 2 slides of my presentation is, on the one hand, we see that the Chinese emperors, for example, in the second half of Imperial China, right, became increasingly secure. That is, they are less and less likely to be deposed by the elites. But at the same time, the Chinese government became weaker and weaker in the second half of Imperial China, right? And then so the puzzle that motivated the whole book is the following. That is, I want to know why we see short-lived rulers governing a strong state. That is, in the first half of Imperial China, we see those, rulers being assassinated by the elites all the time, but then they govern a very strong state with a lot of taxation. But then in the second half of Imperial China, we see long-lived rulers controlling a weak state. That is, they can stay in power for a very, very long time, but then their government became weaker and weaker. So that's the puzzle that motivated me to write this book. At the same time, by answering this puzzle, I also try to shed light on the historical question about China. That is, in Imperial China, in the second half of Imperial China, from the 11th century to the early 20th century, we see 2 trends going on at the same time. On the one hand, we see the consolidation of an absolute monarchy. That is, the ruler's power became stronger and stronger. But at the same time, the Chinese state became weaker and weaker. So why do we see these 2 trends going on at the same time? Right? So before I tell you my answer, I want to very quickly tell you the conventional wisdom. That is what previous scholars have been arguing. Just very quickly, I think the first 2 arguments can be summarized as the origin of the Chinese state will determine the nature of the Chinese state in the next 2,000 years. And then, both the, from Karl Marx, but also from Karl Wittfogel about the idea of Oriental despotism, that is the Chinese state was born as a result of the need to manage flood and irrigation, right? So, the idea is that there needs to be a centralized state to manage the flood. Therefore, that determined the nature of the Chinese state for the next 2,000 years. But also the argument about political culture, that is Confucianism, once it emerged 2,000 years ago, determined the nature of the Chinese state in the next 2,000 years. So both of these arguments are saying that the origin of the Chinese state shape how Chinese government developed over time. And then the third argument proposed by historians is saying that we should look at Chinese history as a repetition of dynasties. And in each dynasty, there's a cycle. That is, at the beginning of the dynasty, you often have very strong rulers, very good policies, but then toward the end of the dynasty, you have very bad rulers, and the peasants will rebel to overthrow the old dynasty, and then the new dynasty will emerge. So, that argument would imply that Chinese government, the Chinese history, should be understood as repetitions of those cycles. But according to the graphs you see at the beginning of my presentation, none of them is right? We don't see, according to these two arguments about Oriental despotism and political culture, we should not see much change in Chinese history in the 2,000 years. Once it formed, we should not see much changes, but actually we see a lot of changes. And then also we didn't see the cycle. We actually see, linear changes, linear increase, for example, in the first half, and then linear decrease in the second half. The more recent social science work either focus on the beginning of the formation of the Chinese state, for example, in the Qin dynasty 2,000 years ago, or the downfall of Imperial China in the early 20th century. But they don't talk about what happened in between, right? From the graphs we saw at the beginning, a lot of things happen in between. And then actually what happened in between is actually the most interesting part about Chinese history. So the social science work really doesn't talk about the middle period of Imperial China. So in the book, I argue that the main argument of the book is that I argue the Chinese rulers faced a trade-off, that is, I call the sovereign's dilemma. That is, the coherent elite that could take collective actions to strengthen the state was also capable of overthrowing the ruler. And then, in other words, I'm saying that every ruler in the world, right, has two goals. One goal is to maximize their own personal power. That is, they want to have a lot of power. They want to be safe. They want to stay in power for a very, very long time, right? But on the other hand, they also want to have a strong state. They also want to have, taxation, a strong military power, so that they can defend against foreign enemies. They can put down domestic rebellions. What I'm saying here is the Chinese rulers was facing a dilemma. That is, they cannot achieve these two goals at the same time, right? The reason is that if they want to stay in power for very, very long, they want to maximize their own power, they have to weaken the elites. They cannot have a very coherent elite, right? Because when you have a coherent elite, they will be able to rebel against the ruler, right? But once you weaken the elites will not be able to strengthen the state. So therefore, the ruler can either stay in power for very, very long, have very strong personal power, or a strong state. They cannot do both at the same time. Let me elaborate on my argument a little bit more. In the book, I argue that there are two ideal types of what I call elite social terrain. That is the social structure of the elites. And then in one ideal type is what I call the star network. You can see here, looks like a star. And then there are several circles here, right? There are two circles in the middle, but also circles in the periphery. The circles in the center represent the central politicians. You can imagine them as people who work in the central government. In contemporary China, for example, they are the Politburo politicians, right? And then the peripheral nodes are the local elite families in different geographic locations. For example, some are in the north, some are in the south. And then what makes the star network very special is the ways in which those politicians and then local elite families are connected with each other. So for example, the central politicians here are connected through social ties. And in this book, I focus on intermarriages. That is, their sons and daughters are married with each other. Therefore, they're connected through social ties. But at the same time, every one of the central politicians is connected with the local elite families located in different geographic locations. So for example, this politician's daughter, for example, might be married to the son from this family in the north, and then his second daughter might be married to the son from this family in the south. Therefore, you have the centrally connected network in the capital, but also the central elites are also connected with all the local families in different geographic locations. So that's the star network. The second ideal type is what I call a bow tie network. In the bow tie network, you also have central politicians, but they're not connected with each other. There's no intermarriages between the sons and daughters of the central politicians. Also, each of the central politicians is connected with the local families only in one geographic location, right? So, for example, this central politician is connected with local elite families only in the West, and then this central politician is connected with local elite families only in the West. Therefore, their family interests are localized, right? So these two graphs are ideal types, in the Weberian sense, that is, they're ideal types. The reality is often messier, but I think they're very powerful in helping me generate some hypotheses in explaining the things that I care about. The first thing is ruler duration, that is how long the Chinese emperors were able to stay in power. The second outcome is state capacity, that is how strong the Chinese state was. So for the star network, my argument is this is really bad news for the ruler, but great news for the state, for the following reasons. Because the central elites, when they're connected, they can take collective action, they can coordinate it with each other, they can trust each other to rebel against the ruler when they want to. Therefore, this is really bad news for the ruler, right? The elites are just easier to coordinate to rebel against the ruler in the star network. But this is great news for the state because for the same reason, the central politicians, they can trust each other, they can coordinate on the policies to initiate some programs, some policies to strengthen the capacity of the central government. But also because their family interests are scattered in all over the country, they also have an interest in doing so because, for them, it makes more sense for them to say, let's pay taxes to the central government so that the central government will provide a national protection, right, to cover all my families in different geographic locations. So for them, they are interested in, right, they have a strong incentive in strengthening the central government. So this is great news for the state, but bad news for the ruler. In contrast, the bow tie network is great for the ruler, but really bad news for the state, because the central politicians, they're not connected with each other, they cannot trust each other, they cannot really rebel against the ruler, even when they want to, right? So this is great news for the ruler, but also at the same time, the ruler can take advantage of the factional fights. For example, this faction, probably have disagreement with this faction. Therefore, the ruler can take advantage of the factional fights within the elites to divide and conquer the elites, to strengthen the ruler's own power, right? So this is great news for the ruler, but this is bad news for the central government because the central elites, first of all, cannot coordinate, they don't trust each other to initiate any policies to strengthen the capacity of the central government, but also they don't have any incentive in doing so because all their families are geographically located in one region, right? So for example, for this politician, he would think about, we should not actually pay taxes to the central government. We should keep the resources at the local level because when we pay taxes to the central government might spend the resources on the other region, right? That's not something we want. So therefore, I don't want to strengthen the central government. I want to strengthen my own families, want to strengthen my own locality. I don't want to have a strong central state. So this bow tie network is very good news for the ruler, but bad news for state capacity. So in the book, I use this very simple framework to explain what happened in Chinese history in the last 2,000 years. I think Winston Churchill was rumored to say, history is one damn thing after another, right? And so I think that, when we study history, it's basically a series of events. But I think what social scientists can do is to impose some structure, some theoretical framework on the damn things, right? We can now explain what happened in history using some theoretical framework. So the theoretical framework is the following. That is, I argue in the first half of Imperial China, right, the Chinese elites can be best characterized as a star network. Therefore, we should expect to see high state capacity and low ruler survival. And then in the second half of Imperial China, from the Song Dynasty to the Qing Dynasty, the Chinese elites should be best characterized as a bow-tie network, and we should expect to see low state capacity and high ruler survival. So today in the presentation, since I probably only have about 10 minutes, I won't be able to talk about every dynasty. The book talk about dynasty by dynasty, but today I will focus on the transition period. I will start talking about the Tang Dynasty. This is the dynasty in the last period of the Star Network, and then talk about what happened in between the so-called Tang-Song transition, and then talk about what happened in the Song Dynasty here. So a short note on how I discovered the data that I used in this book. About 15 years ago, I took a trip to the city of Xi'an. This is a city in Shanxi province. It's one of the oldest capitals in China. But that's not the reason I went to Xi'an. The main reason I went to Xi'an is because it's my wife's hometown. So we were dating at the time. I was going to Xi'an to visit my future in-laws. So this is really a story of how visiting in-laws can have a happy ending, I guess. And then, so my wife, my girlfriend at the time, took me to downtown Xi'an. There was a museum that had an amazing collection of tombstones. Those are, the stones that are lifted on the tombs of Chinese elites, right? From 1,000 years ago, from hundreds of years ago. And what you are seeing here is a picture of those tombstones. So what's amazing about those tombstones is they have a lot of information. So when you start reading the tombstone, on the cover of the tombstone, it has the position, the honor, and also the name of the person, buried in that tomb, right? This is the tombstone, for example, of the prime minister of the Northern Song Dynasty called Fu Bi. You can see his name and here. But then on the back side of the tombstone, it has a lengthy eulogy carved on the tombstone. And then that tombstone, right, from almost 1,000 years ago survived, right, until today. So now we can read what's being carved on the tombstone. And then at the end of the tombstone, it has very rich information about this person's immediate family. So for example, this tombstone says, he married the daughter of Yan Shu. So now we know the father-in-law's name. And then they will say they have 3 sons, Fu Shaoting, Fu Shaojing, and Fu Shaolong, and then their positions in the government. It also mentions they had 4 daughters. The first one married Feng Jing, and then Feng Jing's position, the second one, the third one, the fourth one, right? So, in this short paragraph, we can gather the information on this person's immediate family, the father-in-law, the sons-in-law, so on and so forth, right? And then, so that trip happened 15 years ago when I was working on my dissertation at the University of Michigan on China's legal system. But then it didn't occur to me that those tombstones can be so useful. But actually 8 years ago when I started working on this book, it suddenly occurred to me that, this can be a great source of information for the things that I want to study, right? So that is, if I can systematically study, collect information on the kinship networks of the Chinese elites from, hundreds of years ago, from 1,000 years ago, I can construct the kinship networks of the Chinese elites, right? So, here is what I did with the help of my research assistants. It's easier said than done. It took me 1 minute to talk about this, but it actually took me 2 years to actually collect the data. So the way I did this is I collected the names of all the major officials. By major officials, I mean the officials who held the vice ministerial level position or above, right? Vice ministers, cabinet members, prime ministers, so on and so forth, right? So I collected their names, and then I used the tombstones, but also, archival materials, genealogies, local gazetteers to also collect the names of their family members, including their wife, their sons and daughters, sons-in-law, so on and so forth, right? So I can construct this database, which for the period I'm going to look at, for example, in this presentation for the Tang and Song era, I collected over 4,000 officials from the official histories. And then using the approach that I talk about, I collect over 40,000 individuals in those people's kinship networks, right? That they're for example, their sons-in-law, they're the fathers of their sons-in-law, so on and so forth. And you can imagine there's a huge missingness in the data. That is, only the important people, right, were documented. So therefore, for the graphs I will show you later, we should understand them as indicative rather than representative. That is, they're not the whole population. They're the most important people in the kinship networks. So let's start with the Tang Dynasty. This is the dynasty from the early 7th century to the early 9th century. And then what happened in the Tang Dynasty is there was an aristocracy. There was a noble class of about 200 families. And then these 200 families, for almost hundreds of years, monopolized all the bureaucratic positions in the central government in the Tang Dynasty. And then they also intermarried with each other. What you can see here is the marriage network of the aristocratic families in late Tang period. You can see everyone was married with everyone else, right? I don't know what happened to these two families, but they're not, they didn't hang out with other people, but most of the families were embedded in this very close-knit marriage network. At the same time, we also know they all congregated, they all lived in the capital areas. At the time was Chang'an and Luoyang were the capitals of the Tang Dynasty. The larger nodes here were the aristocratic families, the major officials. They all lived in the capitals, but then through intermarriages, they were able to connect local elite families that were geographically located in different places in Tang China, right? So you can see it really looks like a star network. That is, in the center, they are connected with each other, but also through intermarriages, they were able to connect local families, right? So the Tang elite network was very much like a star network. So what happened to the star network? In the late 9th century, China experienced some of its coldest year. This is the temperature anomaly in the last 2,000 years. And then therefore, as a result, there was a spike of mass rebellions. One of the mass rebellions was called the Huangchao Uprising. This is an uprising led by a salt merchant, Huangchao, in the late 9th century. And then they conquered the capitals of Tang Dynasty and occupied the two capitals for 2 years. During the 2 years of occupation, the Huangchao rebels killed almost all of the aristocratic families who lived in the capital areas. And then that changed Chinese history. So starting in the 10th century, after the death of all those aristocratic families, the Chinese emperors in the Song Dynasty started to use the civil service examination system to choose bureaucrats. That is, they put into place very competitive exams, very standardized exams for local elites to take the exam and then send their sons and grandsons to the central government to work, right? And then one effect of the civil service examination system, according to the historians, is it localized the social relations of the Chinese elites. That is, once the exam became so important, Chinese elites became very interested in land holding. That is, they want to control a part of land in the locality and then invest in the land with the hope that they can generate some income, so to invest in their sons and grandsons' education. There's no women at the time, unfortunately, couldn't take the exam, so only men could take the exam. So the local elite families would control some land and then invest in their local relations to cultivate a local power base, and then with the hope that their sons and grandsons can take the exam and then go to work in the central government. So as a result of this, the elites in China, starting in the 10th century, started to build local networks rather than marrying people from long distance. That is, they tend to marry their daughters and sons to the local families. And then as a result of this, there's a localist turn of Chinese elites starting in the 10th century. That is, Chinese elites start to marry locally, not long distance. And then that's also shown in my data. That is, starting in the Song Dynasty, this is the 11th century, we see that in the center, once those sons and daughters, right, the sons and grandsons from the localities succeeded in the exam and then they work in the central government, they realize that they don't know a lot of people in the center. They don't know a lot of people in the capital. And then therefore, when you see the marriage network of the central politicians, it's no longer as connected as the network we have seen before in the Tang Dynasty. That you see here, there are still some connections, but then you can see a lot of holes in network. You can see a lot of people who are not connected with the majority of the people in the central network. At the same time, when we see the kinship network of the central politicians, they also became more localized. This is one example that I show here, this is a very typical kinship network that has a long distance reach, right? The hometown of this politician is here, but then his daughters and sons married families from far away, right? But this is a very typical localized kinship network. That is, this hometown of the politician is here, but then his sons and daughters primarily marry people from the nearby provinces. So this is what happened in the 10th century, in the 11th century. That is, the networks became more like this in the 10th century, the 11th century. That is, they became localized, and also in the central politicians became very fragmented. They're no longer connected with each other. So two things happen as a result of this, right? On the one hand, as the central politicians, they work in the capital, but they're not connected. Their sons and daughters are not intermarried with each other. This is what I call elite fragmentation. That is, the central elites are no longer trusting each other, right? And then we start to see factional fights, starting in the Song Dynasty, but also Ming Dynasty, Qing Dynasty, so on and so forth. And then this really gave the Chinese emperors an opportunity to divide and conquer the Chinese elites, and then to strengthen monarchical power. And also, what we see is the Chinese emperors became increasingly secure, and then they are less likely to be deposed by the elites. And then they were able to stay in power for a very, very long time. On the other hand, as the Chinese elites became localized, that is, they all marry their local neighbors, they no longer, even though they work in the central government, right, they no longer are interested in strengthening the central government because they do not want to pay taxes to the central government. They actually have a great interest in keeping the resources at the local level. They want to empower their own families rather than empowering the central government. So this also means that the incentive to strengthen the central state became weaker and weaker in the second half of Imperial China. That's why we see, for example, at the beginning of the presentation, the policies in the second half of Imperial China became the policies where they actually want to decrease the taxation of the central state because they want to keep the resources at the local level, right? So, that's the whole argument. So to summarize, I guess, what I'm saying in this book is, we really need to pay attention to elite social structure when we try to understand state building and state development. That is, the physical policy, the state capacity of a government not only depends on, the bureaucracy, the structure of the bureaucracy, formal institutions, but also on the structure of the social elites, right? That really is very important determinant of the incentive in building the state. So with that, I think I have reached my time, I guess, and then I will stop here. This is the cover of the book. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you so much.
Professor Wang, an extraordinary presentation, and I think a framework which is pregnant with theoretical possibilities in our context. Of course, the methodology you've used is almost unthinkable in our local context, where those sorts of written and those sorts of genealogical resources are simply not available. There have been some impressive breakthroughs by Africanist historians using oral traditions to do historical work, but the kind of physical and material resources which you're able to use is just not available, and yet the methodology is so absolutely compelling. I tell you why I find this very, very exciting. The work that I've been doing recently, and of course you're dealing with a different time frame, which is of almost unthinkable in our context, and you make a point in your book that you end in 1911 precisely because you don't want a bias of being too close to the historical material, which of course is a mistake which I necessarily make as an academic dealing with the contemporary phenomena, but also dealing with public policy. So I'm fully aware that I would be making a profound methodological error in your terms, but nonetheless would be interested in your thoughts on contemporary China. But just that dynamic of state capacity being strongly related to the ability of a central authority to dominate regional elites and to coordinate and integrate amongst themselves, and weakening state capacity related to the dispersion of elites and the assertion of regional and local power. I find that typology extraordinarily compelling. So the work that I've been doing in South Africa, I've used very similar terms, but not exactly your terms, although I'm increasingly engaging with your terms, to explain some of the dynamics in South Africa. One of them, you'll be unfamiliar with the personalities, but I think our audience will be familiar with them. One of them is the presidency of the early democratic period of Thabo Mbeki, which I have understood very much as a period of consolidating central elite control and of building state institutions. And I think during that early period of South Africa's democratic transition, there are some impressive successes. For those of you that are familiar with the public administration literature, especially since Woodrow Wilson, you will know that there is profound skepticism of democratic governments to build state capacity, to build bureaucratic capacity in this regard. I think the legacy of the experience of the African National Congress in its first decade of power really moves against that literature, because in the first 10, 15 years of ANC rule, there are some quite extraordinary successes at building central state capacity, a national treasury, a South African revenue services, a tax collecting agency, with enormous achievements in the first democratic period. I think, though, and this is what I think Polokwane is. Polokwane was a conference of the African National Congress in 2009, where essentially that government is brought down by massive resistance from within the African National Congress. When I've done very rudimentary work around tracing the genealogies of those people, I find that they're very overwhelmingly, these are local and regional elites that resist and oppose President Zuma, President Mbeki. And if you like, what I've argued is that the coming to power of Zuma is a wave, is brought to power by the assertion of their authority and their power of local and regional elites against the central state. So this is why, Professor Wang, your framework is incredibly compelling, because what it does is that it fundamentally weakens national and central elites, and the consequences of that is a tremendous decay or decline in the capacity of the South African state to provide almost anything, electricity, water, we call it infrastructure, service delivery in South Africa, any kind of infrastructure. There's a tremendous decline in the ability of the state to provide services. So I think the framework which you've used is incredibly compelling. I would love to know, you in your book, and of course, I'm interested in bureaucracy, the institute which is hosting you, we're fundamentally interested in questions of public administration. The centrality of your argument, some of your argument rests on the side of the introduction and the abolition of civil service exams. I would love you to talk a little bit about that instrument in managing this kind of elite contestation that you're talking about, the elite social terrain. So I'd love to hear more about that. I'd love your thoughts on how your framework works in the African context. You've written about that. And then personally, I would love to hear your thoughts on what this says about contemporary China for current developments in China and how one can understand them in terms of your framework. So 3 questions. Of course, you don't have to pay attention to them, but nonetheless, I think it would be interesting from my point of view. Raphael, if there are questions from the audience, then we can deal with them after that. So back to you, Professor Wang. Thank you so much. By the way, on a personal note, I became interested in the topic of my new book, which is also my wife's family's village in Serbia, looking at graveyards of unmarked graveyards of former German Deutsche Schwabe, which were German-speaking residents of Serbia. So we have a one commonality there, a kind of personal relationships mediated by unexpected gravestones. So I enjoyed that personal note. Over back to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chipkin. Can I just double check? So the second question is about what does this mean? How should we understand the South African experience? Is that the question?
No, which you've written about in your book, how your framework of the elite social terrain applies in the African context and how it speaks to the challenges of post-colonial Africa.
Right, exactly. Okay, great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Great questions. Let me briefly answer all of them and then see whether there are questions from the audience as well. I think the first question is about how did the civil service examination system, but also the abolishment of the civil service examination system in the early 20th century, shape the elite social terrain. I think, the start of the civil service examinations. So they started actually really early on in the 6th century, 7th century, but was not systematically used. That was during the Tang Dynasty, because at the time there was dominance of the aristocratic families, so they still dominated politics in Tang China. So they actually didn't want to use the civil service examination system because they want to use their pedigree, right? They want to, just pass their position to their sons and grandsons, so on and so forth. So at the time, for hundreds of years, the civil service exams were not used systematically. It's only after the deaths of all those aristocratic families in the 9th century, starting in the 10th century, the emperors were able to rely on the civil service examination system. I think there are two significances. I think there are the two important things that happened after that. One is it really prevented the rise of a new aristocracy. That is, in Europe, for example, right, there has always been an aristocracy. I think they were weakened probably after World War I, right? And then the war really weakened the power of the nobility. But I think in China, there was a nobility for hundreds of years, until the 9th century, and then there was the rebellion that killed off them. But then you might ask, why didn't the Chinese elites form a new nobility in the 10th century? I think the reason is really the competitiveness of the civil service examination system. That is, in my book, I talk about in 1,000 years, right? From the 11th century to the early 20th century, there were very few families who were able to succeed in the civil service exams for 3 consecutive generations. There were probably, I can count using my hand, basically, in those, 1,000 years, that a family can keep succeeding in the civil service examination for about 3 generations or 4 generations. Very few of them could do this because it's very competitive, and also there are a large number of people, right, in the whole country who are taking the exam. So it's actually very difficult to keep sending your sons and grandsons to the central government. Therefore, it's very difficult for any family, even the most powerful family, to monopolize the bureaucratic positions. I think that's the most important consequence of the exams. The second consequence is very similar to what we are seeing in contemporary China. That is, probably in South Africa as well, and certainly true in the US today. That is, if you want a very good education for your children, for public schools, right, you need to live in a very good school district, because, in the US, but also in China, you can only go to that school if you have the residence in that school district. And then therefore, in China, what happens is the rich families will buy a house, very expensive houses, but very poor houses. If you look at those houses, you couldn't imagine why they're so expensive. They're expensive only because they're in a very, very good school district. So, and then they can send their children to the school in that school district. And then that's happening in the US as well. And then that's happened in Imperial China. That is, you need to have land, and then to use the income generated from the land, and then to invest in your children's education, because there's often a local school, for example, in that county. You can send your sons and grandsons to that local school. They can then be educated and then take the exam. So therefore, that really tied all the Chinese elites to a particular locality. So they therefore incentivized them to build a very localized social relation, that is to intermarry with the local neighbors. I think that has, as I talk about in the presentation, that really localized the social relations of the Chinese elites. And then but that civil service examination system, right, lasted for a long time. It started in 7th century and then got abolished in the early 20th century in 1905, because the late Qing government felt the reason why China fell behind, the reason why China was invaded by the Western powers, lost all those wars in the Opium War, so on and so forth, was because of the education system. So they saw that, we are poor, we are backward because we have a bad education system. So in 1905, they abolished the civil service examination system, which was a huge mistake, because for almost 1,000 years, the civil service examination system provided a channel for social mobility for the Chinese elites. That is, for no matter where you are, as long as you have some money, right, to invest in education, your sons and daughters, even your, the sons and grandsons, even though you are a peasant family, for example, if you can save some money and then you can invest in your son's education, they have the opportunity, right? They have the opportunity to take the exams and become a bureaucrat. And that changed the life of a lot of people. And then with the abolishment of the exams in 1905, the Chinese elites lost this channel of social mobility. That is no longer, they can no longer change their fate, right, by taking the exams. I think there was a paper that argues that the abolishment of the exams directly contributed to the downfall of the Qing dynasty. That is, the local elites no longer believe they can change their fate by taking the exams. So that's the first question. The second question about African state building. In the book, at the end of the book, I spent some time talking about how my theory can travel to other regions in the world, for example, Latin America, the Middle East, and then also sub-Saharan Africa. I argue that pretty much, in pre-colonial era, there was variations in Africa, right? But in pre-colonial era, in a lot of the so-called decentralized societies, I think it looks pretty much like a bow tie network. That is, you have some local elites, chiefs, for example, they have local connections, but then, they're not connected with each other, right? They have their local power bases, their tribes, but then they're not connected with each other. And then there was some centralization effort, I think, during the colonial period, but also in the post-colonial period, that the new government was trying to centralize the power by co-opting, but also incorporating the local elites in the families, in the central government. But then I think most of those efforts were not very successful. So therefore, pretty much like Dr. Chipkin said, I think one of the consequences of democratization is actually incorporating the local elites into the central government. And then therefore, when the local elites, they have local interests but they work in the central government, they actually have a very strong incentive in empowering their own localities rather than strengthening the central government. Therefore, I think, as a result of democratization, in the early period of democratization, there's actually a period of state weakening. My colleague, Robert Bates, also wrote a book about this, and then he argues that in the early era of democratization in Africa, actually, we see state weakening rather than state strengthening. The last question about what this means for contemporary China, I think, the main lesson I draw from Imperial China is there's a trade-off between a strong ruler and then a strong state, right? That is, you either have a strong ruler or a strong state. You cannot have both. And then what we have been seeing in China in the last 10 years since Xi Jinping, the chairman of the Communist Party, took power in 2012, is we are seeing a strong ruler, right? We're seeing a strong leader. And then as a result of a strong ruler, what his strategies are in the last 10 years is really to weaken the elites, which is very similar to what the Chinese emperors were doing. That is, if he wants to stay in power for a very, very long time, he has to weaken the Chinese elites. And then that's what he has been doing, using the anti-corruption campaign. What we have observed in the last 10 years is he used the anti-corruption campaign to attack the Chinese elites, to break their networks. They don't want, he doesn't want the Chinese elites, the Communist Party officials, to be connected with each other, right? He wanted to break those networks. And then as a result of this, the Chinese elites were weakened. But he can take, he maximized his own power. He can now stay in power for a very, very long time. But then as a result, the Chinese elites were weakened. But then, as I showed in the book, the ultimate consequence is also the Chinese state will be weakened as a result of this. Let me stop here. Yeah.
Quite astonishing. I mean, I don't want to dominate, so I want to hand over. But in South Africa, one of the really topical issues, especially one which myself and some of my colleagues have been pushing for, is our public service reforms around the introduction of a civil service exam. And I think some of the resistance is precisely that currently there are no criteria for entering the public service. But I think that what that does is it allows regional and local elites who are not educated in South Africa, or not especially well educated, access into the state. So you've given a suggestion of the way of how the current system operates, which I think is quite original for me anyway. Let's open up to, if we've got a few more minutes, we've got 10 more minutes. We've got some fabulous people that have joined us. I know some of them. Peter Wagner from Barcelona has joined us, which is a great pleasure. So thank you very much. I don't know if you would like to contribute. We have a question from Mafino Pora. In Professor Wang's observations during his research, do the elite, once they depose the incumbent ruler, actually go ahead and install their own new emperor? In other words, are they kingmakers or aspiring powermongers themselves?
Yeah, they're primarily kingmakers. And so what happened usually in Chinese history is the emperor usually has a lot of sons, and they have, sometimes 20, 30 sons, and then in normal times is primogeniture, which means the eldest son would succeed. But then the elites usually have their favorite. Usually is probably the second son or the third son, and then what happened after the deposition, after the assassination of the old emperor, is the elites will choose their favorite son to be the next emperor, and then they often build connections with that son, very early on. But then they know that, for example, this son is the second son, so therefore there's no chance for this son to become the new emperor. Therefore, they assassinate the old king and then support the younger king. Yeah.
Are there any other questions?
Yes, we have one more question, Ivor. If you can read, could you read on the chat?
So I think this has been discussed. What is the trade-off between a strong state versus strong ruler, in particular in states with strong oligarchs which direct states with money like the US? Perhaps Benjamin April, you could come online and just pose the question directly.
Yes, hello, can you hear me? It's Benjamin.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, I just want to ask, in today's context, it's where you have a strong state or where you have a strong ruler, but in current society, particularly where you have, particularly in the Western society, particularly also in South Africa, where you have very, very strong, transnational corporates that have very significant influence on state policy and on state, and particularly you see this proliferation of these think tanks all over the show, that you end up having rulers actually, or the state listening to the think tanks and actually rather than to the will of the people. What happens? What is your view on that? Thanks.
Thank you so much, Benjamin. That's a great question.
Should we take it? There's Su Huang. Do you want to pose the question directly, or should I read it out? Su Huang is actually someone I met, very interesting, Chinese student who was based I met him in St. Petersburg, where he was studying with Maxim Khomyakov, and now I think he's at Brown University. And Su, forgive my pronunciation, asks, thanks for the great presentation. I'm wondering, how do you establish the causal relationship, which is one of the preconditions for your analysis, if I understand it correctly, between a strong elite and strong state capacity? Because I don't think it's always obvious that the former leads to the latter. So there's a question there of methodology and causality. I think we're running out of time, so those are going to be your last two questions, and then we're going to end off. But thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much, both, for Benjamin's question and also Sue's question. I think for Benjamin's question, I briefly discussed this. What this means, for example, for Europe, for the US. I think one difference between Europe and the US and China on the other hand is that, in Europe, right, gradually in the 12th century, 13th century, most of the countries in Western Europe developed parliaments, that is, representative institutions. I think, I argue that in the book, representative institutions, parliaments, partly solve the sovereign's dilemma. That is, because the institutions, on the one hand, give an opportunity for the elites to bargain with the kings, right? Because they can, they don't have to kill the king. They can go to the parliament and then bargain with the king. Therefore, it secured the European kings and queens. That is, we don't see a lot of deposals in European history, right? Starting with, the 12th century, 13th century. There's a paper that shows the duration of European rulers was very, very long, about 20 years. And then that's pretty much because of the parliament. On the other hand, the parliament also enabled the the European kings and queens to make a credible commitment to the Chinese, to the elites, to tax them. This is the North and Wangast argument. That is, with the parliament, the European rulers were able to say, I will spend the money only in the way that you tell me to do, right? I'll tax you because I want to have a war, and then you can pay your taxes. But then after I collect your money, I will only spend the money on wars, not on my palace, for example. So that was guaranteed by the parliaments as well. So therefore, I argue in the book the rise of representative institutions in Europe, but also the existence of Congress, for example, in the US, can solve the sovereign's dilemma in some sense, right? Not completely, right? Not completely. And then for Sue's question, causality is often very difficult to establish in a setting like this. This is long term, but I think in one paper, in one of the chapters in the book, where I look at the Song dynasty, where I look at the so-called Wang Anshi reform. This is one of the most important physical reforms in Imperial China. I was able to look at the formation of the kinship network, right, as a result of the previous generation's kinship network. That is, I can use the previous generation's kinship network as an instrument, right, instrumental variable sense, to instrument for the current generation's kinship network, and then use that to predict their attitudes in the state building reform. That is, whether they support the reform or oppose the reform. So using some statistical techniques, I can deal with the causality problem. But I think in general in the book, causality is not the main concern, because my argument is not about the causal effect of the network. It's really about how the kinship network, how the elite social terrain and state capacity were associated with each other, how they shape each other through a long period of time.
Professor Wang, can we take one more question? I see
Yeah,
Kulu
sure.
Bata would like to pose a question. So Kulu, can I hand over to you? So I think we'll like to bring the conversation to an end. I think there's tremendous interest in the topics, Professor Wang. I think the presentation's been extraordinary and compelling and exciting. And I think what I love about it is its originality. There are a whole lot of quite original ideas. I must be honest, I'm especially for an Africanist, I'm rather tired of hearing that the condition of state capacity is war and war making, which puts us in a rather awkward situation that in order to progress, somehow we need to fight with our neighbors or be invaded. So it's for me a very optimistic, strangely, a very optimistic scenario that if one can better manage elite relationships within society, that one has a chance then of building the kind of government capacity which one needs. One element which I think going forward would be interesting to explore, and it's certainly the case in the African situation. Would be interesting to see over the long durée of the Chinese example. There's no discussion of capitalism, of industrialization, of the kinds of elites that emerges in those situations, of urbanization. So it would be very interesting to see how those sorts of dynamics would affect your broader hypotheses. I think they would only strengthen your hypotheses, to be honest. On that note, I'm going to bring today to an end. I know Professor Wang only had an hour for us. I'm hoping that we've managed to convince him that this is a dynamic intellectual audience and community. I think of which we can learn a lot, but I think you could learn a lot as well from our experiences. And I'm hoping that we can have you back, certainly online in the near future, to continue the conversation. So on that note, I want to thank everybody for joining us. It's been, for me, a riveting hour. I think everyone has thoroughly enjoyed it, just on the basis of the WhatsApp messages I've been receiving. I'm very pleased that you're all able to make it. On that note, Professor Wang, thank you very much. I'm going to end it, and good afternoon and good evening to everybody. We'll see you again next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dr. Chipkin. Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.